We're in the book of Daniel still. I think there's another couple of, at least one more. I want to tell the story of, or go through the scriptural story account of Belshazzar and the writing on the wall. And then we're going to bow out of Daniel and go to our next book. But we started all this in Isaiah. Remember, we were in Isaiah tracing the promises of God. Yahweh says in the book of Isaiah, I am the only God. I know of no other. And we bounced from there to the book of Daniel to see all these false gods that Satan says, no, God's not the only God. There are all these false gods, and that's what we've been looking at. We've been in the book of Daniel seeing the fact that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, worshipped false gods. That he had, remember, he made this tower in commemoration or memory of himself, and he wanted all his Babylonian citizens to bow down when they heard the music, to bow down and worship his image and all those things. They're all idolaters. Israel has been pushed out of the promised land, been sent to Babylon, but it's not a clean nation. Babylon's worse than Israel ever was. They're a nation of idolaters. In the book of Isaiah, in chapter 41, I want you to turn to it with me tonight. That's where we're going to be. Yahweh, through the prophet Isaiah, challenges the nations of Gentiles and their false gods. Again, Isaiah is a great book where Isaiah records Yahweh's words, I alone am God, I know of no other. He says it very many times in the book of Isaiah in different ways. But in Isaiah chapter 41, Yahweh's sovereign protection of Israel is the topic. Can I protect Israel against the nations, the hateful nations, the Gentile hordes that want Israel destroyed? Can I protect them? What's the answer to that? Yes, I can protect them. In Isaiah chapter 41, God uses Isaiah, but God challenges the Gentile nations. He says, why don't you bring your idols, your false gods, your satanic counterfeits? Why don't we check with your counterfeits and see if they can explain the past, the human history the way I can, or if they can tell the future like I can? Can they make predictions? Can they make prophecy? Do they know what I know or not? And the answer to the question should let you know that I'm the only God. It's what's happening in Isaiah chapter 41. Start with me in verse 21. In Isaiah chapter 41, verse 21, I want to look at this challenge that Yahweh gives the nations and the false gods. And in verse 21, he says, present your case. This is legalese. These are lawyer words. And what God is saying is, let's go to court together. Get your evidence together and present it. You want to be gods? Satan, you want to lift up these false gods by whatever name you give them? You want the people to believe that they're as strong, as mighty, as intelligent as I am? Let's have a contest. Bring them forward. Let's do it. So he says, present your case. This is Yahweh speaking through Isaiah. Had Isaiah pen these things. He says, bring forward your strong arguments. The king of Jacob says. King of Jacob, in the eyes of the nations, Yahweh is simply the national God of Israel. He's no better than Marduk or Baal, the god of Babylon, no better than Baal, the god of the Canaanites, no better than any of Dagon, the god of the Philistines. He's just another national God. And God says, if that's who you think I am, nothing more than the king of Jacob, the king of Israel, I'll call myself that. Let's play this way. Let's see how this ends. So Yahweh says, present your case. Bring your strong evidence. So again, through Isaiah, Yahweh's playing along. If you think this is all I am, okay. For the sake of argument, I'll call myself the God of Jacob. Nothing more than a national God. Let's compare what I can do with what your false God, your satanic false gods can do. It's a challenge from Yahweh directly to the gods and to the nations who worship all these gods. He says here, one Hebrew word tonight, he says, bring forward your strong arguments. Atsumot is the word, A-T-S-U-M-O-T, atsumot. It's a legal word. I tell you, this is courtroom language. And God says, let's go to court together. Bring your evidence. Let's try it. Let's weigh it in the balance. Atzumot is evidence in a legal decision. God challenges the nations. You want to worship satanic gods? Let's see what they can do. Let's see what they are. Let's again weigh them beside who I am and see who indeed is God and who is not God. That's what's going on here. Again, courtroom talk. Verse 21, it says, let them bring forth. God, again, continuing to issue His challenge. Let them bring forth and declare to us what is going to take place. Isaiah is a wonderful book of God making prediction and saying, I'm going to do this to this nation, this to this nation. He makes all these predictive prophecies, and only God can do those things because only God knows all things, and only God has the power to make all those things come true, right? So that's what we see in the book of Isaiah. Certainly here, he says, let them, these nations, these Gentile nations with their false gods, let them bring forth their false gods and declare to us what's going to take place. You want to worship these gods instead of me? What can they do for you? It's very gracious God again. As for the former events, declare what they are. Explain to us what the plan is, what history is, where Adam originated, how he fell, how you're going to save him, you false gods. Give us your plan for human history. Look backwards and explain to me what has gone forth. As for the former events, declare what they were, that we may consider them and know their outcome. He's challenging the wisdom and the intelligence, the knowledge of the false gods. He says, or announce to us what is coming. So his challenge to the nations and to their gods is to bring forth your gods, your idols, and let them explain the flow of human history. Tell us what happened in the past. Tell us why it's important, and tell us what's going to happen in the future and why it's important. If you're so smart, lay out your plan and let's take a look at it. They have no plan. We know that they have no plan. Satan has no plan. All Satan wants to do is ruin things and ruin man's relationship with God. But that's God's challenge. In verse 23, he says, declare the things that are going to come afterwards. Tell us the future, that we may know that you are gods. If you want to prove that you're God, show us that you're omniscient, that you know all things, that you don't have to be told and taught things, that you know all things and you can predict the future. Go ahead, false gods. Let's hear it. You don't want to be challenged by this God. Then he says, indeed, do good or evil, that we may anxiously look about and fear together. God challenges them with sarcasm here. Says, do something good or something evil. It doesn't matter. Do anything. If you can do anything, do something, do anything so that the world might take notice of you, so that you might have some effect on the world. If you are a God, prove it. I'm giving you the opportunity. Prove it. Right now's your choice. Prove it. But we know that they are obviously non-existent, they're ineffective, and they're useless, even though Satan is behind them. So let's talk about Satan just for a minute. We know, and we've gone through many, many times, that one of God's attributes is omniscience, and that means that He knows all things. We know that God is omnipotent. That means that God has all power to do whatever He wishes to do, He can do it. No one stops Him. He doesn't ask anybody permission. He's omniscient. No one's ever taught God anything. No one's ever counseled with God. God has never asked anybody, the greatest man that's ever lived, Satan, the greatest angel that He ever created. God has never gone to anyone else and said, what do you think I should do in this situation? I find myself in a pickle needing some advice. It's never happened and it never will. He knows all things. He's perfectly knowledgeable. What about Satan? Why is it that Satan and the false gods can't come up with a plan? Why is it that Satan and the energized false gods who are gods propped up by Satan, why can't they speak? Why do they have mouths but can't speak, ears but can't hear, eyes but can't see? Why is that? Satan is a limited being. Satan doesn't know all things. Satan doesn't have all power. Satan answers to the same God you answered to. And we see that in the book of Job, where God delivers Job up to Satan and says, if you considered my servant Job blameless in all his ways, and Satan starts to make accusations against Job, and God says, you can do this to Job, but you can only go this far. You cannot touch him. I will protect him through this first trial. Who's in charge? God is. God tells Satan, you can only go so far. Afterwards, Satan comes back to Job. They have a similar conversation. Have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says something to the effect that the only reason Job does these things for you is because you protect him and give him all things. Take his life, threaten his life, and he'll curse you. And so God says, okay, Satan, you can threaten his life. You can't take it, but you can give him these boils from head to toe, and we'll see whether Job falls or not. And he didn't. He complained a lot. He murmured a lot. He had a lot to say. He was upset with God. He wanted his day in court. He wanted to know why him, a blameless man, had been treated like this by God. He thought things were awry, but he never questioned God's omniscience. He never questioned God's omnipotence. As a matter of fact, what you read in the book of Job is Job basically telling God, you're a bully. The reason you're doing this to me is because you have all power and you can do these things. But I've done nothing wrong. And you know that. And if I had my day in court with you, if I could present my facts to you, you, Yahweh, would realize that you were doing this to me in an unfair way. By the end of the book, obviously, Job, the scales come off his eyes. God talks to him in chapter 38, 39, and 40, and 41 even, and Job concludes that I'm a fool. Who am I to question the Most High God? He bows in humility before the Lord. I should have known you knew what you were doing. You know all things. And Job relents from his frustrations against God. What we have going on here is God challenging nations, saying, I am omniscient, and not even my created angel, the highest of my creation, my created angels, not even Satan is omniscient. He, even though he's the one that hatched all you false gods, all this idolatry, Satan cannot tell the future. He cannot display the past in the plan of God. He doesn't know it. If I don't tell him, he doesn't know it. If he doesn't witness it and learn it, he doesn't know it. He's not God. So who then is the real God? Yahweh or Satan's false gods? Well, Yahweh is. And that's what he's trying to get at here. Satan has propped up all this falseness. Humanity is falling for it, but you shouldn't. I'm the only God. That's the challenge. Verse 24, continue looking at it. Behold, you are of no account. It says God speaking to the nations and their false gods, specifically speaking to the idols, the false gods of Satan. You are of no account, and your work amounts to nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. So to what he says here, to the false gods, you're of no account, you have no power, you're certainly not all powerful, you have no power at all, you have no knowledge at all, you're certainly not omniscient, and anyone who would choose to follow you and reject me is an abomination to me. An abomination to me. Idolaters. Detestable in God's eyes. And you think, why is it? Look at this verse. Why is it that somebody who simply chooses to worship a false god, why would God consider that person detestable and an abomination? Look what it says in 1 Corinthians 8. What I'm trying to bring out is the fact that every man has the true God. Every man knows that God exists. We know that from the Scriptures. And why would you reject the true God to worship Satan's false gods that are ineffective and non-existent? And God says about that, that's abominable to me. I won't have that. It's detestable to me. In 1 Corinthians 8, chapter 8, verse 4, Paul says this, therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there's no such thing as an idol in the world. There is no idol because there is only one God. What is an idol but a material representation, right? A little carving that you can touch that represents your false god. That's all an idol is, a pestle. It's a material representation, whether it's carved out of wood or molten silver, gold, whatever it is. It represents a god who doesn't exist. So what is an idol? It's nothing. It has no value at all. It's ineffective. It's nothing. It's of zero account in God's reality. It's nothing. So here Paul is telling, I can't go off into this story, but Paul is telling these Corinthians, when you have an opportunity to have meat that has been sacrificed to idols, don't consider it evil meat, because it wasn't sacrificed to anything, because idols don't exist. There's only one God. That's the point here. It's not meat sacrificed to idols. It's meat that went through some process that had no value whatsoever, because there is nothing. There are no idols in the world. There are no gods that the idols represent. There's nothing behind it. It's a ritual without reality. There is no God but one, 1 Corinthians 8. So God says concerning anybody who would choose to worship Satan's lie and reject God's truth is detestable, an abomination to God. How could you do this? It reminds me of a song. One of the lines in this song says, how could you want him when you know you could have had me? And I can hear the Lord uttering that same phrase. How could you want to follow Satan when I'm here? How could you choose this? It's an abomination. It's inexcusable. I won't excuse it. I don't have to. It's detestable to God that men would choose the lie rather than the truth, God Himself. They exchanged the truth for a lie. Verse 25 says this. God says, you can't tell the past, you can't predict the future, but I make a prediction right now. In my omniscience, I will lay out my plan before you, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to the nations. And He says in verse 25, I have aroused one from the north, and he has come. From the rising of the sun, he will call on my name. Which direction does the sun rise in? In the east. So from the northeast, God will call out a king, a conqueror who will come. He's not on the scene yet. As a matter of fact, He won't show up for 200 years. But 200 years before the event, God says, I'm sending Him. Can anybody guess His name? Let's keep reading. Don't throw out a name yet. I have aroused one from the north. He will come from the east, from the northeast, from the rising of the sun. He'll call on my name. Doesn't necessarily mean that this king is going to worship God, uniquely worship Yahweh, but it means he will do the bidding of Yahweh. He will do what Yahweh asks him to do. He will be God's servant. He will come upon rulers as upon mortar, even as the potter treads clay. He will destroy the nations in his path. This king that God says, in the future, I will send him. So Yahweh here in verse 25 predicts and makes a promise to the nations and all their false gods who can't tell anything because they are nothing. I'm going to raise a king that will come from the northeast who will come and conquer the nations of the world. What's the king's name? What? Rabbi. Come and get your trophy. You get a trophy. Don't let Gail take it from you tonight. The book of Isaiah is the great book in which God names the name Cyrus for the first time. You don't know the name Cyrus for 200 more years in human history, but God says, because God can, I won't say, I don't want to get beyond the word here. I won't say that God is showing off, because God doesn't need to show off. He's perfect. But God is flaunting His abilities a little bit. Not only does He say a king is coming, but in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, He names Him. Bold statement. One day a woman will bear a child and she will name him Cyrus. And because I can do it, I will raise that particular boy named Cyrus up to be the king of Persia. And when I'm ready and I call him, he will conquer all the nations in his path. And when I'm ready, this same conqueror of Persia, Cyrus, will send Israel back to the land of Canaan. It's Cyrus who I will raise up to give Israel back their temple. Who can do that? Can a false god do that? Can Satan do that? God can do that. Yahweh can do that. And that's what he says here. I'm sending a king. I'm bringing him from the northeast. I'm arousing him as if he's asleep. He doesn't even exist for another 200 years. But in God's mind, there is no time. He knows all things at the same time. So he says, just as sure as you're breathing your air today, in 200 years Cyrus is coming. By name. In Isaiah 45 verse 1, this is what he says. Thus says Yahweh to Cyrus his anointed. Koresh is the Hebrew pronunciation of the word Cyrus. Koresh is this king's name. So thus says Yahweh to Koresh his anointed, the one who he's anointed. This is the name Mashiach. This is a name that God usually reserves for Jesus Christ, the Messiah. But he has called Cyrus on a specific mission to destroy nations and to bring Israel back into the land. So he has a job to do. Thus says the Lord to Koresh his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand, to subdue nations before him and to loose the loins of kings. Cyrus the conqueror, Cyrus the great is coming. God makes that prediction. God makes that promise in Isaiah 41. He's coming to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. He predicts that Cyrus is coming. And what's one of the other things that Cyrus is doing? We have to back up one verse to see that. The last verse of Isaiah 44 is verse 28, and this is what it says. God says concerning Cyrus, it is I who says of Koresh, Cyrus, he is my shepherd. Cyrus, a Gentile. Interesting words, aren't they? He is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. What does God say about him in verse 25 of Isaiah 41? That he will come and he will call on my name. It doesn't mean he's going to worship me. What it means here is that he is going to perform all that I tell him to. Everything that I desire for the nations and for Israel, Cyrus is going to get it done. He will do my bidding. That's what it says. He will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, the great Cyrus is the one that God called out to say Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And of the temple, Cyrus the Great will say, your foundation will be laid. Who can do this? Who can have a Gentile leader from Persia conquer the nations that he wants to conquer and lift up Israel and Jerusalem at the same time? God is on display here in Isaiah 41 saying, I am God. Nations of the world bow down to me. Worship me. Stop buying the lie of the devil and all the satanic false gods and worship me. I alone exist as God. That's what Isaiah 41, the message is. So, how many years in between God making the prediction that one would come from the northeast, the Persian Cyrus the Great? How many years before between the prediction and Cyrus coming? 200 or so. 200 years of human history go by. No one hears of anybody named Cyrus. The Assyrians take control of the north. The Babylonians take control of the south of Israel. Nobody hears of a man named Cyrus, but I bet a few were waiting for him. I bet a few were waiting for Cyrus, some great king from the northeast, to show up. But he never shows up. And Assyria comes and destroys the northern kingdom, and Babylon comes and destroys the southern kingdom. And this Cyrus seems to never show up from the northeast, from Babylon, until you get to Ezra chapter 1, verse 2. And then you see a man in Persia named Koresh. Cyrus shows up on the human scene. Should anyone have doubted that a man named Koresh would show up and that he would live in the northeast of Jerusalem, the northeast of Israel, should anyone that worships Yahweh have ever questioned, God promised this, He predicted it, He prophesied it, we should be looking for His servant, His anointed, His shepherd to come out of the northeast. He said He's coming, we should be watching for it. That's how it should have gone. And one day, 200 years later, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. God says in Isaiah 44:28 that Cyrus is coming and Cyrus will declare that Jerusalem will be built. What's the interesting thing about 200 years earlier when he made the prediction in Isaiah? What's the interesting thing about the city of Jerusalem? What was the condition of the city of Jerusalem when in this verse God says that one is coming in the future and will say Jerusalem will be built? What's the interesting and the intriguing thing about Jerusalem in Isaiah 44? Standing or destroyed? No. Standing. Alive and well. Was a worship center. The high priest was there. Israel was alive and well. Jerusalem was alive and well for another 150 years. There was no problems in Jerusalem. I mean, there was idolatry there, but they were alive and well. So how could God make a prediction that a man would come later named Koresh and would say Jerusalem will be rebuilt and the temple's foundation will be laid? What does that mean, Isaiah? I can see the temple right there. That's the intrigue. The temple's right there. How can you say that the foundation of the temple will be laid? I worshiped at the temple this morning. I took my sacrificial animal there. There's the temple. So what is God doing in this great statement of Isaiah 44? But saying, yes, it stands, and yes, the walls of Jerusalem are up, but I will destroy it one day, and then send Cyrus to have it rebuilt. That's omniscience. That's knowing everything. And the false gods can't do this. They can't do anything but because they don't exist. That's what's going on. So 200 years go by. We get to Ezra chapter 1. The 70 years in Babylon are almost up. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, this man from the northeast that has destroyed the nations, become the ruler of the world, has this to say. Remember, he's going to come calling my name. Cyrus says, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Remember that it said he will trample on the nations like a potter tramples his clay. He did it. And after the fact, because the promise came true, Cyrus says, God has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and God has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And everybody that read that should have said, wow, this God knows all things. This God can do all things. This God named this man whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents weren't even born yet. He names this king that he would come from the northeast, destroy the kingdoms of the earth, take control, and one day rebuild Jerusalem. And it's happened exactly like he said it would happen. Is there anything that you should be afraid of that God's made a promise to you that you might think, I just don't know if He can keep this promise. I don't know if He's wise enough to keep this promise. I don't know if He has enough power to keep this promise. Is there anything in the knowledge of what we have as Christians that you question? Do you ever question your death? Do you ever question it on the day you breathe your last breath as a human? Do you ever have a nagging suspicion whether heaven exists, whether God will take you to heaven, whether God will give you a glorified body like the body Jesus has, whether God will reward you for your service as Christians, whether God will reward you by ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ during the millennium? Do you ever question that? Or do you go to the Scripture and say, God can do everything He says He'll do? There's no reason for us to question anything that God has promised us, ever. Because of these crazy things that He can tell the future, and not only tell the future, but name the king that's coming and make it all happen. The fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the rise of Cyrus the Persian, the destruction of Babylon by the Medo-Persians, the destroying of the nations by Cyrus, and one day Cyrus's decree, Jerusalem shall be rebuilt. That's what God is doing in Isaiah chapter 41, saying, I am God. I've made you a promise. You look into the future. You tell your kids and grandkids about this, and they will know that I'm Yahweh. Look what it says back in Isaiah 41, verse 26. Who has declared this from the beginning? God says, who can do this but me? Who can tell you these things are going to happen 200 years before they happen? I alone am God. How can you have Him? How can you want Him? How can you worship all these false gods when I'm right here in front of you? An abomination. Who has declared this from the beginning that we might know? What's the answer? Only Yahweh. God's next question, or from former times, who has declared it that we may say, yep, He was right? Who makes these predictions? Only Yahweh does. He's the only God. He's the only omniscient being in existence. Only Yahweh God. Surely there was no one who declared. God says, none of your false idols can do this. None of your false gods could do this. Surely there was no one when I issued the challenge, bring your evidence, come to me with what you want to tell me, show us that you are God. Surely no one showed up, right? Well, of course not. Surely no one has declared. Surely there was no one who proclaimed. Surely there was no one who heard your words. In verse 27, he says, formerly I said to Zion, behold, here they are. And to Jerusalem I will give a messenger of good news. Who's the messenger who's coming with good news? It's Cyrus. It's Cyrus. I will bring a messenger of good news. What's the good news that's coming through Cyrus? Isaiah's prophecy 200 years ago about me came true. The God who made the promise, the God who challenged the false gods, He alone is God. He was right. He said this day was coming, and here I am. From the northeast, I've destroyed everybody in my path, and one day soon I will rebuild Jerusalem. Two bits of good news. Number one, your God, Yahweh, is a promise-making, truth-telling, prophecy, future-seeing God. He knows all things. You can trust Him. Good news number one when Cyrus shows up. Good news number two, the exile is over. I'm sending Israel back to Babylon back to Jerusalem because that's what God has raised me to do, to free the Jews from captivity, from exile. He's the good news bringer. It's Cyrus. Israel's prediction, Isaiah's prediction came true, Yahweh tells the future, and Yahweh has the power to bring the future to pass. Yahweh can tell it and make it happen. That's good news one. Again, good news two, the captivity is over. You're going home. Great news for Israel. Let me ask a couple questions as we close. Which gods knew this ahead of time? God issued a challenge. You want to say, I'm just a national God, all you nations? I'm no stronger than any other God. I'm no stronger than Baal, Molech, Dilka, all of these gods. If you want to say, I'm just the God of Jacob, just the God of Israel, fine. Let's challenge the gods. Let's see who can predict the future. Let's see who has omniscience. Let's see who can prophesy of something coming 200 years down the road. Which gods knew? Only Yahweh. Because why? Why did only Yahweh know? Because there's only one God, and His name is Yahweh. And that's what so much of the book of Isaiah is a proof of. I am the only God who's ever existed. Only Yahweh knew the Jews would go back into the promised land. Only Yahweh knew that Jerusalem would be destroyed. Only Yahweh knew the temple would need rebuilding one day. Only Yahweh could see through the events of human history and make these predictions. Only Yahweh. As a matter of fact, Satan and his false gods didn't even have a hint, didn't even have a clue of what was coming in the future. Now, why is that? Because Satan is a limited being. He's not omniscient. He doesn't know all things. As a matter of fact, Satan would have preferred that Israel stay in Babylon, wouldn't he? Would Satan have wanted the captive Jews who were out of the land, the temple being destroyed, the holy city, God's city of Jerusalem? where He presented Himself, where He lived the Shekinah glory? Would Satan want Israel and God to be reunited and Jerusalem to be rebuilt and the temple to be restored? Does Satan want that? Well, of course he doesn't. Satan would have preferred that Israel, once kicked out of the land, stayed out of the land. He could destroy them there much easier than he could in Israel. So not only does Satan not have all knowledge, he also doesn't have the power to make his desires come true. His desires are to destroy Israel. Yet when you look on a map today in 2024, what do you see over there in the Middle East on the Mediterranean coast? A little bitty dot of a nation called what? Israel, the Jews. Because God protects Israel against the Gentile hordes. And that's exactly what Isaiah 41 is. I'm coming over you Gentile nations. I'm protecting Israel, and you watch me do it. You think you're false gods or something. You think you can attack my people Israel with your false gods because they give you power. I alone am God, and I can protect my city. And when I want to destroy my city, I can have that city rebuilt. You watch me do it. That's what he does in Isaiah chapter 41. That's what the thing is about. Who has all power? If Satan doesn't, then who does have all power on earth to do whatever he pleases? There's only one. A couple of verses. 1 Samuel 12, verse 22. For Yahweh will not abandon His people on account of His great name, because Yahweh has been pleased to make you, Israel, a people for Himself. Who can change that fact? That Israel is God's chosen people. Israel is God's peculiar nation. Israel is God's the nation that He called out to be special and called special and set apart to Him and His service. Who can change that? Careful with your answer. Who can change that? Somebody says God can change it, and some people say no one can change it. Can God change this? He cannot. Why can He not change this? Because He made a promise to Abraham. He made a promise to David. He made a promise to Israel that the land would always be theirs. He made a promise to David that they would have a king, that David would have a king on his throne forever, the Lord Jesus Christ, that the nation Israel would always be God's chosen people, and God doesn't break promises. It can't be changed. So regardless of what any power, what any Gentile nation in any generation that's tried to do on earth, God will not abandon His people Israel. And Hamas and Hezbollah and people like that and earlier people like Adolf Hitler should have read this book and realized, I think God's on their side. And if God wants to discipline them, I'll let God be the discipliner. I will stay out of that. I will bless His people because God says that He will not abandon Israel because of His great name. What does that mean? It's God's character and His promise-making character that secures Israel's present, their past, their present, and their future. Israel doesn't exist because they're wonderful any more than I exist because I'm wonderful. Israel exists because God made them a promise. And He's a promise keeper. And there's a period after that. It's over. He will not abandon His people because Yahweh was pleased to make Israel a people for Himself. Jerusalem, there will always be Jews on planet Earth eternally. The new earth, the new heavens and the new earth will have Jews on it eternally. David's throne will always have a person on it eternally, and that person's name, once he takes that throne in the future, is Jesus of Nazareth. A promise is a promise. God does what He pleases. Satan cannot. Psalm 115, 3 and 4, but our God is in the heavens. He does whatever He pleases. What does it take to do whatever you please? What attribute do you have to do whatever you want to do? You have to have all power. I want to build a skyscraper tomorrow. Not start tomorrow, I just want to do it tomorrow, start to finish tomorrow. What would I need to do that? I'd need the power of God. Could God do it? Absolutely, because He does whatever He pleases. How can He do that? Because He has all power. In comparison to God, Psalm 115 says, but their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. God is in the heavens. God can do anything. What about the idols? Look what it says in the next verse. The idols that men choose to worship, well, when they reject Yahweh, they have mouths, but they can't speak. You call them gods? They can't even speak out loud. And you want to worship that? They have eyes, but they can't see? How in the world could they guide you? How can you look to them in your divination? How can you look to them through your crystal balls and want your future told by them? They have eyes and they can't even see you, much less see prophetically into the future. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have noses, but they can't smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. You see what God is doing here? Who's God and who's not? I'm God. They aren't. And it's an abomination to anybody who would put their faith in a false satanic god. It is a detestable act to God. How could you want Him and those false gods when you could have me any day you wanted to? They cannot make a sound with their throat, and those who make them will become like them, everyone who trusts in them. Isaiah chapter 41. They who make them will become like them. Verse 28, two more verses. But when I look, there is no one. God issued a challenge. Come forth. You want to challenge me as God? You want to bring your abilities as a God, your omniscience, your omnipotence? Come forth, all you false gods. Let's do it right now today. Let's get it out on the table. We'll solve this. But when I look, there is none. There's no counselor among them who, if I ask, can give an answer. Why is that? Because they have ears but can't hear, and mouths but can't speak, and eyes but can't see. Even if God were to say, can you help me out? There's no one who can help him. Because there's no other God. There's no one else at His level. Even if He were to seek counsel, no one could do it. If I ask, no one can give an answer. Behold, all of them are false. Their works are worthless. Their molten images, their idols, are wind and emptiness. Just like the wind, unless you're a sailor, doesn't offer any help to a human, neither do these false gods, these idols that the nations worship, offer them any help. And God has just proven it in Isaiah chapter 41. Come forth right now. Let's settle this. Am I God or are you God? It happens in the Scripture several times. There's another event in the Scripture where this happens on Mount Carmel. Can anybody tell me who the players are? On Mount Carmel, when a prophet of God stands up and says, you people are worshiping all these false gods. I'm here to tell you they're nothing. Your God Baal, your God Asherah is nothing. And today we settle it. Today we decide whether Yahweh is God or whether Baal is God. Today we settle it on Mount Carmel. You gather all the prophets of Baal together, all the priestesses and the prophets and the priests of Asheroth. You bring them to Mount Carmel, and we are going to have a challenge. Who did that? What's his prophet's name? Elijah. This kind of showdown happens over and over in the Scriptures as God will call someone out and say, do my bidding, go fight this war for me, stand up for me. In Isaiah chapter 41, God says, everybody step aside, I'm going to take care of this today. God shows up on the scene. God makes the challenge to the false gods the way Elijah did, the way Elisha did, the way others did in the Scripture. God does it Himself in Isaiah chapter 41. How many gods are there? There's one. What's His name? Yahweh. That's the point. Let's close in prayer tonight. Heaven